Well, thank you for coming back for our third episode. Today, we have an amazing, in depth interview with Rob Wipond, who is just so good at giving us a broad spectrum of the landscape of our mental health care system in BC and beyond.
As Emmy says, this was a very broad conversation. Rob took us through a number of elements of the mental health system, not only in BC, but across North America, and how it really shapes treatment for patients within the system. So he looked at, a number of the legislation, laws, policies across North America, but then also got into more of the nitty gritty about how people are being treated at some of these facilities, including things like the diagnostic net that psychiatrists are currently using and cultural visions of mental health. And one of the things that he talked about throughout was the political landscape, the funding, and the political rigidity that exists right now. Now, Rob approaches these topics as a freelance journalist. He's also a creative nonfiction writer who writes frequently about the interfaces between psychiatry, civil rights, community issues, policing, surveillance, privacy, and social change.
His articles have been nominated for 17 magazine and journalism awards in science, law, business, and community issues. And he's the author of the book, Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. We will put lots of links to Rob's work in the show notes, so please go check out his work, buy his book. And just so you know, this content can be a little heavy. So if you need to take this episode in a few separate chunks to really let it integrate, I definitely encourage that.
That being said, we really hope that you enjoy our third episode of the podcast and our first interview. Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you on the podcast for this episode. And I just want to start off by saying that I think a lot of people know you in British Columbia and around North America for the work that you put in writing in a number of magazines and newspapers on mental health and mental health policy, and specifically detentions around that. So we just want to say a big thank you again for joining us today.
All right. It's great to be able to explore these issues with the both of you.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of the work you've done in your career, bringing voice to many voices that aren't heard historically. So I'd love to just start by asking you, how did you get into this work? And yeah, how did it all start?
I always had an interest in the inner workings of the human mind from childhood. Became fascinated. I was an avid reader, and my family had a lot of books around, and my dad was a bit of a keener when it came to reading books of philosophy and things like that. So yeah, I just always had that bent. So I'd say that was kind of the foundation. And then at various points, strange little things interfaced with my life where I would kind of find myself thinking about the mental health system. And even though I had no direct interaction, nobody I knew did, but I might see a show or read a book, or in around university, I think the light really started to go on when a friend of mine actually did briefly get locked up in a circumstance, and I knew him quite well. So I knew, wow, this is really strange, because he seemed pretty fine to me, like it was just an unusual situation that really sunk in my head. And then it happened to my father in the late 90s. When I happened to be visiting them, my father got a cancer diagnosis, and that kind of really, sent him for a loop, and all of the things with cancer. And then the surgery was prostate surgery, had profound repercussions where he became impotent and incontinent. So really difficult thing to be facing. And it, as he was just retiring, and he started to have emotional troubles. And then I was there, and, it was serious. I would say certainly that it was unusual, and he was expressing himself in strange ways, but it was easy to also kind of turn that around, talking with him. It's going to be all right. You'll get through it, that sort of thing. And then at some point, like, I had to leave, and my mother was getting anxious, and talked with my brother, and they decided to go into a psychiatric hospital for help with my dad. And it was all voluntary at that point, and then but it was very rapid that they just decided, well, this guy's crazy, and they locked him up and they started aggressively treating him with medications, and all of those just made him worse. Really, he could barely stand. Then oh well, we have to give him electroshock, and we were like, what? Electroshock is still around? Oh yeah, it's a primary treatment for this treatment-resistant depression. Anyway, this went off the rails, and so over 9 months in and out of the hospital, we all just became aghast at how he was treated and how much worse he got, and just how he had no rights in this circumstance. And so that really made me start to say, wow, if this can happen to my dad, a career college professor of computer engineering, a person with all the supports you would want to have, caring family, financially okay, all those things. This can happen to him. Who else is this happening to? And what's happening to them when it does happen? And so I started to investigate and find out more.
Wow, Rob, I'm very sorry on a personal level to hear that you and your family had to go through that, and especially to your father who had to go through such treatment, which, I mean, I know for those that are familiar with the system may not come as all that much of a shock, but to those that are outside and haven't had experience or known someone with experience, I think these stories that you write about, that your family has experienced, and that you outline in your latest book, which is Your Consent is Not Required. I mean, I think this is going to come as a little bit of a wake-up call to a lot of people. I mean, for you, when you started delving into these matters, what came across to you as particularly stark about the current mental health system and the sort of doctrine that we have in North America? What were the most shocking factors about this system and the way it operates to you?
Well, the only way I can respond to that is most honestly to say the answer to that is why I ended up writing an entire book. Like the book is basically wall to wall the shocking things, the most shocking things that I encountered, and I couldn't fit everything in this book. Like there's just no end to when you start to look at how terribly covered it is, like how little people know until you really start looking at it. It's so poorly reported, and there aren't even very good studies about inpatient care in North America, let alone involuntary inpatient care. So there's not a lot of science into it either. So I mean, I think that was the first thing, is like, what a dark hole. But at the same time, because I was working in a community, like I was working really in Victoria, British Columbia for a long time, there was a great interaction that took place where I would write about some of these kinds of cases, and then I'd be recognized on the street by people. Oh, you don't know the half of it, and they'd start telling me something, and so there was this loop of communication, and I rapidly started to learn about all these aspects of how the mental health system has really permeated all these parts of our society that most people don't really understand, far beyond the hospital walls, into our communities in all these different ways. And that's much what the book explores. But I would never have known that had I just been a journalist that kind of worked at a national level. It was really about being in a community where I met people on the street, people saw me, recognized me, and so that I could learn about these things, because they're not reported, they're not written about, they're not even studied in large part. And so then I just went, well, is Victoria different, or is this going on everywhere? So when I knew what to look for, that's what I started to really find this stuff, right? And so, yeah, then what can I say? I mean, I guess that I'd say the single most shocking thing is just how broad the laws really are. We're kind of constantly told, oh, these laws, it's really hard to incarcerate anybody under mental health laws. But the reality is it's not at all. It's just that they have so much discretion, and it's so unpredictable who really needs help, who doesn't, and in what ways, that lots of people who seemingly might need help don't get it. And lots of people who don't want the help end up getting it against their will, because the judgment calls are just being made in the dark a long time. And the laws have been designed to give doctors enormous flexibility in how they make those judgment calls. So I think that was the single most shocking thing, is they're much broader than what people imagine. You don't have to be really a danger to anyone in the way people colloquially think about that. It's like, well, might you in some way be deteriorating in your life somehow. Like these are how the laws are actually kind of written. Deterioration is one of the main criteria right now. We don't even know what it means, really.
Hey, thank you, Rob. And, personally, as myself, someone who's been through the system and all of the beautiful work you've done, speaking to the people that have lived experience being incarcerated and, having their freedoms taken away. What was that like for you to realize the power of psychiatrists and how little control many BC citizens in particular have over their own life? Like, why are the laws so archaic in BC? And yeah, why are people's freedoms being taken away?
We'll answer the second question first because it's easier. The British Columbia Schizophrenia Society, I don't think I'm disclosing anything here that they would be surprised by, or anyone that's been in this politically active in this area in British Columbia for a long time. The BC Schizophrenia Society has been very active in promoting more aggressive forced treatment laws and in going into court cases and intervening to protect the laws that are there. And they've had enormous influence because their board, for example, long included one of the leading chiefs of police in the province for a long time, as well as the manager of clinical psychiatry for the British Columbia government. So they had backtracks and inside tracks to all sorts of ways to influence how the laws have developed. So that's why British Columbia has really the most draconian laws that I've seen in all of North America, most aggressive. But, this other question you ask, a word comes to my mind when you talk about how do I feel when I look at that power that psychiatrists have. And I'd like to ask you, because you've been through it, what is, if you were trying to reduce that to one or two or three words, like how does it feel when you're in that situation yourself and you see for the first time where they're saying something like, sorry, you can't go. And no, we're going to give you this drug, whether you like it or not, and things like that. What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, thank you. I think what comes to mind is that the system was based on complete and utter fear. It's sort of like instead of trying to help people from their heart, from compassion, from listening, like you said, when you're talking to a family member or when I'm talking to a friend who's in trouble, I would be like, oh, they're going through a hard time. Like, I'm going to sit with them. I'm going to listen to them. Right. And then I go into the hospital and I'm chained down on a stretcher with my wrists bleeding, talking to through a intercom with a locked door, um, and treated with complete dehumanization. I would say that from my experience, I was treated like
Yeah.
an animal. So um,
Oh,
I think that the system is based on like the worst case scenario, right? It's like, is this person a murderer or are they gonna kill themselves? And I was like, whoa, just because I'm having a really hard time and I'm having an experience that's hard to articulate, like, doesn't mean we need to go all the way to the extreme measure. So it's interesting what you say about the impact of the Schizophrenia Society, because I can imagine, I'm just trying to empathize with their perspective. Maybe there are family members that are worried about their physical safety, and that physical safety took precedence in the laws or something. I don't know.
no, yeah, that's actually it. Thank you for sharing that. It sounds terrible, and I'm really sorry you had to go through that. And what I want to say to every listeners, those terms you use, like fear, dehumanizing, treated like an animal, these are things that I'm hearing all the time, right? This is not a rare thing to hear. And honestly, when I looked at how my father was treated objectively, I was not in that situation myself, just witnessing it from the outside. And it was just shocking and terrible. And yeah, I don't think people realize just how common this really is. And like you say, I think fear is the word I would use too. Even when I look at that from the outside, when I look at how these laws are written, I feel anxiety and fear because I can see like, wow, it is a fine line between where I'm sitting right now and being locked up in a psychiatric hospital and having these kinds of things play out, particularly in British Columbia, where they can forcibly drug you for weeks before you even get a hearing, before you even get the opportunity to talk to anyone outside the situation other than the psychiatrist who's made this decision. So yeah, it is incredible. And yeah, I'm not sure. You had asked a question towards the end of your thing, but it slipped my mind now what you'd asked. Sorry, because I'm just so, as you know, it can be really emotionally overwhelming to kind of confront the reality of this. Oh, you talked about the extreme, and I do think that's it. Like, so there's fear on both sides. I feel fear when I see it, really, and then you see that fear is behind a lot of this. So families, legitimately or not, like we can get into that question in any individual case. You might go, well, I really understand why they have a fear. But in other cases, I don't. Like, I think, no, this is all about the family members having too much fear and this person having a fairly average kind of set of problems. So you see both, right? Depending on where you might be on the spectrum of how well you handle people just talking about dark feelings, saying something like, I feel suicidal. Like some parents just can't handle hearing that. I heard a parent say that the other day at testimony. He said, when I was suicidal, I wasn't afraid of killing myself and I wasn't afraid of talking about it. When I hear my child say it today, I freak out, he was being honest about this. And I think that's really important for people to understand. And this has really played a huge part across North America in driving the current legislation. These families, with their fears, are very active in lobbying governments, and they tell very compelling stories. But unfortunately, their stories aren't the only ones that are happening, and we need more greater balance in the public discussion.
That's very interesting, Rob, what you're talking about there when you're discussing the dynamics between patients, families, and practitioners as well. I know in my family's case, this was a theme that kept recurring throughout my father's treatment, but before his suicide. And I just wonder if you have any sort of guidance or nuggets of wisdom, perhaps, when we're talking about this sort of interface and consent laws. And what is your insight on what could be the path forward here? Because as I understand from your previous talks and from the book, the most recent book that you've written, the balance of power really hangs, as you say, with those laws in the psychiatrists and the medical practitioners that are treating these patients. And it's really their sort of diagnostic criteria and their assessments of patients that determine the ultimate treatment outcome. Do you envision a sort of better interface there between the different kind of stakeholders, patients, and parties that might be involved in a recovery plan or treatment options?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I wish that these kinds of legal changes and systemic changes came about through genuine stakeholder discussions with diverse people at the table and all that, but they don't. They're largely coming about not only in BC but around North America right now, particularly aggressively through lobby organizations that have a very strong particular agenda, and that is to continue to expand the criteria under which people can be detained and forcibly treated also when they're living in communities. So unfortunately, so that would be great, right? That alone, if in fact these were multi-stakeholder processes where people really got heard. And unfortunately, the people that are largely locked out of these discussions are people who have personally experienced it, so they can speak from that expertise, like, this really damaged me. And if you say that, you're often blocked out of these discussions. And then the people that ally with them, like myself, they're usually blocked out. The people who get in are the people who are sort of in alliance with, we need to be more aggressive. So that's one thing. I mean, in the book, I explore a bunch of these things. And I got to say, like, there's just so much that's wrong with the system right now. You can pretty well pick any aspect of it and go, there's an easy place we could improve. And then more radically, I do think the World Health Organization has come out and said, we have to abolish this. We have to get rid of it. There's really no need for it. And there's no evidence, scientific evidence, that it actually helps people over the long run. So, I go to that point. I do say we need to consider actually getting rid of this altogether. But even before we get there, because politically we're going in the opposite direction right now, so I know that's not going to get much traction. But the transparency. Let's get better data. Let's track people. Let's ask them after we forcibly treated them. Follow up a year later and say, would you like to tell us about overall? Have you improved? Have you not? Can we talk with you about kind of the measures we might use? We could follow up with people and have, again, an interdisciplinary group looking at that information and data and kind of putting out a report about real world outcomes from this experience in your community, right? And then if everybody did that, we'd have it across different communities and institutions and see how many people are getting better, how many worse. Just the lack of accountability in this space is shocking. I think that you've experienced that, right? Where you've attempted to complain about how your father was treated, and you've watched the layers of just people ignoring you and no one being accountable for this. Like when someone gets harmed, really harmed, who's liable for that? Well, guess what? Nobody, because that's the standard of practice. So yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I just think there's a lot of ways, if we were working together, that we could improve this system for sure.
Thank you for that. I'm really curious about how privilege plays into the treatment that people get, because, thinking about social location doesn't seem to factor in, but I've noticed this theme where the people that really need the help, who come for the help, don't get it. And the people that maybe don't need that kind of help get traumatized by the system. So how does privilege play into this whole mental health care system?
Yeah, in so many ways. We do. We don't have great national level data because there's so little tracking that. But wherever someone has attempted to do a study of this, we find that the same prejudices we see in society around race, around class, around sexuality, gender, all the common dominant prejudices that exist tend to play out in the mental health system as well. And one of the reasons for that is that at the heart of this, at the heart of the issue, is that when a psychiatrist, average psychiatrist, looks at a patient and he's got two patients who are in all terms exactly the same, it's the patient who says, I'm fine. I don't want your help. Stay away from me. That person in the psychiatrist's mind is sicker, quote unquote, sicker than the person who says, I really need help. I'm really in distress. So if those two people are equal and one's saying, I want help, that person is more often sent home. Because why do I have to hospitalize you? Because you're wanting help. Here, take these drugs, go home, call me in the morning. You don't even get the call in the morning usually, right? And then the person who's resistant, they're like, well, we're going to have to lock them up to make sure they get treated. And so that then plays out because often the people who are coming with some resistance are the people who've had bad experiences in the past with healthcare systems, with authoritarian systems, right? So I'm more likely, I would think, I don't have evidence of this, but I just say, if I'm an Indigenous person in Canada, we have tons of studies showing they have very bad experiences overall with healthcare systems generally. Leave aside the psychiatric system, healthcare generally. So if they've had those experiences, they're more likely to be kind of saying, can I get out of here like now? And then they're more likely on that basis alone to be forcibly treated, let alone the existing prejudice that may be there because I think Indigenous people are X, Y, or Z, more this, more that, right? Some other prejudice I might have that's operating. And we do see this. So I'm not just speculating or theorizing. We have really good studies that Indigenous people in most countries are many more times likely to be forcibly treated than similar people who are not Indigenous. And in the United States, certainly we see that with Black minorities also being more likely to be forcibly treated. So extreme that even this year, well, not this year, but last couple of years, the American Psychiatric Association has issued a number of sort of statements of apology for their history of racism in the whole sphere of mental health, including involuntary care.
Wow. I mean, thanks for that really good answer, Rob. But on that note, I think there's another related factor here, which you allude to in your book, talking about the sort of cultural perceptions of what is mentally sane or mentally normal, and how these have dominantly come from sort of a white folks perspective, often in kind of the colonial era, and how this has kind of factored into the diagnostic metrics with which psychiatrists use to assess the severity of patients. And I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on what that sort of means for people that might not be of sort of a quote unquote North American culture.
Yeah, you raise a great point, and I have a case in my book, as you know, that of an indigenous woman in Coast Salish territories who had that kind of experience where she said frequently when I get into a heightened state, and and she would usually know, okay, I'm in a heightened state, something's going on, but she would often, her religious beliefs exist, her pre-existing religious beliefs become heightened in some ways, and she would try to act in ways that reflected those beliefs, but those beliefs were seen largely by white medical staff as being not normal, actually symptoms concretely. For example, like one of her beliefs was that negative energy could flow out through the eyes and through the head. And so it would good to kind of cover yourself in some ways. She wore a little head covering to kind of keep that energy in. And then the medical staff thought, oh, well, this is a symptom of schizophrenia because you believe that you can affect people with pure energy kind of thing, which is a common belief that people have when they're getting labeled with schizophrenia. And so there are these overlaps. And this is a long-standing problem, particularly around spirituality, because there isn't really, they're trying to change this in the DSM the last while because they recognize it more and more, but there isn't truly a robust recognition of the value of spiritual experiences and the quote unquote normality of them, right? And not only the normality, but often the healing power of religious and spiritual experiences, something which I've personally experienced in my life. I'd say that I've had powerful spiritual experiences, what I've considered very transformative in my life. And there's no question that if I was articulating those in a distressful way to a psychiatrist, that I would have been pathologized for it, right? Fortunately, my friends were all artists and were having weird experiences too, and we could share this and talk about it and figure out what we, valued and which parts we thought weren't full of value, things like that, just treated as another experience in our days. So yeah, it's huge, and that's exactly what you've highlighted is what the American Psychiatric Association is trying to kind of apologize for right now, is this sort of systemic way in which dominant white beliefs about normality have come to the fore and been really strong. And that, we have examples of that historically, which arguably still continue today, just with women even, right? The prejudice, because a lot of the psychiatrists are typically men, and in this dominant sphere, they had a lot of prejudice about how they thought women should act and would be more likely to pathologize certain types of emotions or behaviors. Or they saw Black people as more likely to appear to be violent just because they were themselves more afraid of these Black people if they began to speak out against wanting to change society.
It really gets me thinking, Rob, about like the training that psychiatrists get compared to, say, a counselor, a psychologist, or someone who's used to holding space. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are in terms of how much sway does the pharmaceutical industry have over our mental health care system?
It's been huge. It's interesting because people ask me, did you find evidence of the pharmaceutical industry lobbying specifically on forced treatment? And I say, well, not directly. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It's always hard to get that kind of information without lawsuits and things. But what you do see clearly is the enormous amount of funding coming from the pharmaceutical industry into organizations, agencies that promote forced treatment. So yeah, we see that. I'm sorry, I've lost the thread of your question though.
No,
Oh yeah, just
that,
the influence of the
yeah.
pharmaceutical industry. So yeah, like it's huge, right? And particularly just the medication model that has come with that. And we have to say, even though the money is really pushing this, clearly a lot of people genuinely believe in the biomedical model of mental illness, even in the lack of evidence, and they have the right to that belief. But unfortunately, that belief has become such a dominant part of society that somehow, if you're in distress, you're experiencing some sort of imbalance in your brain that, okay, we can't really isolate it, but that's probably what it is. And so these drugs can in some way help with that. And so that model is very much part of the model of forced treatment, that supposedly we're going to cure you of a disease that you have. There's really no science to hold this up, but it's a compelling belief. And because mainstream society has kind of adopted it, largely since it began with the advent of Prozac in the 1990s. There was a heavy promotional push around the notion of a biochemical imbalance. And now it's spread throughout society, largely because of those efforts. We have people that believe this, and then consequently that translates into force. And I think the latest numbers in Canada, 20% of Canadians at any given time are taking a psychiatric medication. It'd be interesting to see how many of those are truly voluntary, but we assume a large percentage are. So that reflects, I think, society's belief. And unfortunately, that backfires as well, because those people, then that's their association. I took this drug, I wanted this drug, I believe it's helping me. Okay. But then they often translate that into, therefore, I can understand why we need to force it on someone else. But those two things are not connected. I try to say to people at times, it's like, sex, which can be one of the most beautiful things you experience in your life, and sexual assault, which can be one of the most traumatic. That's the difference between these two scenarios we're talking about, and people really need to understand that when they're promoting psychiatric medications or forced treatment.
This ties really nicely, I think, into a larger topic on lobbying, which I know is a central point of a number of advocates on various sides of the political spectrum. But as you've alluded to, I think in the past, the sort of mental health system, as you say, kind of weds the nanny state and the conservative sort of police state ideologies on both the left and the right. And it's really seemingly kind of formed this entrenched political landscape where everyone is seemingly pro-force on this issue. And you talk about, the vast amounts of money that go into the mental health system in the US, even outweighing the judicial system, that being prisons, police, etc. I mean, just astronomical amounts of money and political power behind this sort of pro-force agenda. I'm just wondering, how do we get out of this cycle? How do we break that? How do we see forward and see a new sort of vision for mental health? What are the steps that need to happen there?
Yeah. Um, it's a big question, because I think that, and yes, you're right to highlight, and this is a big part of my book, that I'm looking at the best numbers we have, showing it's just astronomical how much forced treatment is really going on already, coercive treatment in all these different areas of society for all these different reasons, and that is an extension of the carceral system more generally. But this is a problem, because I do think, as I talk about in the book, that there is interest on both the right and the left to promote this way of thinking, because it's a great excuse for governments to be able to blame almost any sorts of problems in society on people being mentally ill. It's a way of blaming the victims for poverty, for any kind of distress, for violence, for anything. And so governments on the left and right love that. It gets spun as a helping activity to the left. It gets spun as a policing activity to the right. And so this is part also of a broader movement right now we're seeing, where there's a tension between anti-policing protests and what governments on both sides again want to do, which is lock down and clamp down. Governments seem to have this inherently authoritarian tendency, which is growing across the board. And I wanted to say, for example, well, we can do mutual aid, we can do we can rupture sort of that authoritarian power of government and do things ourselves. But the latest thing, I don't know if you've seen, but I've read the indictment itself in Georgia, where they're indicting 61 people and organizations under racketeering, conspiracy, and anti-terrorism laws. The Attorney General of Georgia is doing this. to all these organizations that work in areas like mutual aid and social solidarity, and literally read this indictment, and they're portraying that as some sort of criminal conspiracy to overthrow the United States government. It's very shocking. You hope to God that this won't actually stand when it lands in court, right? But the rhetoric behind it that's driving it, the attitudes behind it, show you that we're descending ever deeper right now into governments taking a very aggressive approaches to any kind of resistance or protest. And and the mental health system and forced treatment is just a part of that. So yeah, when you ask that question, it really opens up a broader frame of discussion. But if we work it back to just the mental health component, I, I think that first and foremost, we need public education. People need to be more aware of what's really going on in the mental health system, because I don't think people would really support it. I think they do have illusions. It's presented, and they have illusions because they're being lied to. So it's understandable why people have illusions. But I think we need that as first and foremost, so that people understand what's actually happening in these situations, and then say, what are we really trying to achieve with this system? Because I think most people think of it as a helping system, and that's what they want. And so we say, okay, how can we create a more helping system? And I think with anything, you got to take away the extreme power, right? The moment I have power, it's just too tempting to use it over others, right? Like, but you take it away, guess what? I've got to compromise with you. I've got to negotiate. I've got to get along with you, right? Otherwise, you're going to walk out. I'll have no patience at the end of the day, right? So yeah, that's the best I can say. I don't know if there's anywhere in particular in that you want to follow up with, because it's a broad, spectrum of stuff there that we could address.
I also wonder what the role of the practitioners in, especially those that maybe can see kind of both sides of this, especially those that might be a bit sensitive to the fact that some of these forceful interventions are not necessarily based on a human rights approach, and maybe some people that are even being challenged in their morals to uphold some of the legislation right now. I wonder what role they play in this.
Yeah, I just want to jump in really quick and say that came up for me early in the conversation too. When I was remembering my time in the hospital, a few nurses came to me after forcibly injecting me and said, I didn't want to do that. That made me feel traumatized. I was like, why are you doing it? Like, the protocol is telling you to do it. It sounds to me like our system has such a narrow vision of what treatment is, that other places in the world are doing really cool work, and I'm sure, Rob, you've heard of open dialogue and other systems like in Italy that are community based and really a broad spectrum of care that's really centered in people having purpose and belonging, no matter what their beliefs are. And, of course, like the book Touched by Light by a Canadian doctor really helped me understand spiritually transformative experiences and how they could be translated into post-traumatic strength. These things that are really optimistic are just not part of our Canadian mental health care system. It seems to me, like you said, there's this clamping down, locking down, authoritative, you deserve to be in jail because your beliefs don't fit society. So I'm wondering, Rob, if you think that like our mental health care system is like societal gaslighting.
Yeah. I mean, as one researcher said, forced treatment is based on tradition more than evidence. And yet what you're highlighting here, some of these pilot projects, and some of them have gotten beyond the pilot project phase, have been really, really successful. And there are these models out there that could be followed. And what I highlight in the book and try to emphasize to people is here, one of the locus of the problem here, right in the institutions everywhere, ultimately is the legislation. And it'd be a simple thing relatively to change in legislation. Currently, the mental health laws ultimately put absolute authority in the end with physicians, with medically trained physicians and psychiatrists. So that means in that situation you're in, where the nurses are saying that, that could have very well have been they were probably being very honest with you, and they are ultimately though responsible to the treating psychiatrist, and that's the person issuing the orders. So if we merely changed that in the legislation and said, okay, let's make this, say, I don't know, an interdisciplinary team where five people from different backgrounds have authority to kind of make these decisions, and actual medication driven by the psychiatrist might be just one of the options on the table for how to respond. That alone would be a radical change in the system. And what it would do beyond that in an individual situation is it would also allow, say, the treatment team discussions to be so much better in these situations. Because I can't tell you how often I hear from practitioners like these nurses that you met who would say that. So even when they're in the room alone, not with any patients, but they're as having a staff meeting, ultimately, as psychiatrists have all the authority and power, and they're slapped down and put in their place if they kind of challenge, like maybe this person doesn't need medication. Maybe this person would respond to a counselor that maybe we could get to bring in or something like that. And these ideas often get squashed. So yeah, we could really change it there, and I think that would be enormously valuable.
Hearing your response there, Rob, and Emmy's insight as well. I mean, it's very it can be very inspirational. There's a lot of good ideas out there and potential ideas on the horizon. I'm just keen to get your insight as well, though, on the advocacy path, and specifically as a reporter and as a writer, and what that looks like moving into the political fray that exists right now in the mental health sort of field, specifically around freedom of speech and how you found that journey, because there's a lot of diverging interests here that sometimes don't always marry well with people that are trying to advocate for maybe a potential solution, or just voicing people's stories and potential ideas moving forward.
Mm. It's a very polarized space, right? Understandably, like there's not much that's more polarizing than one person saying, you're crazy and you're so crazy, I don't think you deserve any rights, and I'm going to forcibly drug you right now. And the other person saying, please don't do that. That's a pretty polarized space that we're talking about right now. And so that's reflected in our society as a whole. And in that conflict, that polarization, the thing that makes it different, say, than some of the other polarizations that exist in our society right now is one side has virtually all the power and the other side has virtually none. And that power is very real and very tangible. And so I see that reflected as a journalist going out into this world, trying to understand it, trying to write about it. It quickly, immediately became very clear, and has consistently been clear over the entire 20 years that I've been researching this set of issues. And that is that people are going to run interference on me talking about this. One of the first things that was said to me in a closed door meeting was, why are you interviewing these people? They're crazy. Essentially that was the statement, like this shouldn't even be happening, right? And that is how a lot of the pro-force practitioners, governments see this kind of situation. They just don't want forced treatment being talked about at all, and they certainly don't want patients to be talking about, people who've actually experienced it. And so I run into that kind of resistance all the time, which is why in the end I've ended up more or less, I'd say, siding with a lot of the people who've had these kind of experiences, because I, as a journalist, am being put in this situation where I'm feeling like, okay, this is the kind of powerlessness they experience. And in my own small way, I'm running into these walls and I'm not getting answers, and I'm getting gaslighted. I'm getting, thrown around, and these are really reasonable questions I'm asking, and I'm not literally being pathologized in those moments, but I'm kind of being treated as if I don't matter, as if my point of view doesn't matter, as if I'm doing nothing but creating trouble, even by asking these questions. So that's what I've run into. And you see that embedded in the system. And that's why we don't have good data. We don't have good tracking of outcomes, because I believe, and I don't have the evidence to prove this, but I believe it's systemic wide, because too many governments and too many practitioners that work in this space just don't care. They just don't think it's important to track the outcomes. They like to be able to just go, oh, trust me. In my clinical experience, most people are really grateful. They, bow at my feet after this. They go on and on about how much they're saving people's lives. And then you say, well, why don't you collect the data then to show that? Right. And it's like, you don't even get an answer to that question in most cases. So yeah, I mean, I could go on about my personal frustration with this. I mean, it's true in a lot of issues that you might investigate as a journalist, but this one's particularly extreme, particularly acute, and and that's why I've ended up focusing on it and writing a book about it.
It's almost comical. I read one of the passages of the book that suggested somebody had accused you of being Scientologist because you were asking a particular question. These sorts of accusations are just so outlandish. It's almost comical.
Yeah, yeah. And it comes so fast. And it's done like, see, these psychiatrists in particular are trained to do this. They kind of, I think that they don't realize they're doing it in a public space because they're so used to having been trained to do it in their professional space, where they listen to what you're saying and then they pathologize you with a label. Oh, what is it? Like, that's literally what they're trained to do. I listen to you for 10 minutes and I say, you have this disorder, you have that disorder, and they practice it and they get tested on it. And then in high pressure environments like emergency rooms, they're required to do it like with lineups of people coming through the door under enormous pressure, right? So this is what they're used to doing. And I wish that they seem to understand what I understand, because I'm crazy about my editing. Now, if you send me an email, I'll notice every one of your little mistakes and kind of it'll freak me out, right? I see that in myself. I wish they would see that in themselves, right? But they often don't. They just slip into this mode, and it's shocking to me sometimes. And again, I don't have the personal background. When I look at patients who get into conversations on Twitter or somewhere else in public with a physician, a psychiatrist, and then I watch the psychiatrist do this to them in a public environment, I'm traumatized just watching this go down, and like, if it happens to me, it's painful. And I'm just like, I have no history with this personally, but it still like shocks me. So yeah, I do think that's an area that I see precious little self-awareness going on, ironically, in medical staff. I won't say it's only psychiatrists, it's not. So let's say in medical staff, in people who are trained to do this kind of pathology, and they find it very hard to step outside it. And then it just, and of course our culture is full of labeling anyway, so it is easy to not do that, right? To not notice it, but they should, right? They really should notice it.
It's almost like this automatic authority that we give the medical system to know what to do in those situations. And, in our pre show chat, we were talking about this new mental health number that seems all beneficial, 988, that brings all of these organizations together under one sort of policy, I guess. I'm not really sure the details of it yet, but I just wanted to share that, from my perspective, we need to stop criminalizing the human mind. Like, we need to separate the prison system from people that are suffering. Like, these are two very, that was my immediate thought when I was taken down by police, was that I've committed a crime. And I had like literally just been crying over my ex-boyfriend. So I was just really shocked at how quickly things can escalate. So just for public education, if someone calls 911 on a wellness check, many times police are required to be there in various jurisdictions across BC. And a friend recently told me that they had an experience with Mental Health Act, and they managed to escape the hospital because it was traumatizing, and they had never had a history of it before, and they didn't need that help. And the system was telling her that she needed to be there for 3 weeks, and she had just gone through a massive grief and didn't need to be there for 3 weeks in her own very sound, very sane judgment. So she left. When she left, her phone was traced by the police, and they captured her again to bring her back into the system. So that's the level of extreme things that happen every single day in this province. What do we need to know? Like, if a listener is out there and they're like, I'm really worried about someone's mental health, I never say, call the police. Like, that is the last thing that I needed. It was not helpful for me. So, what would you say to someone who's worried about their family member, and what would be your advice?
Thanks for sharing that story. It is brutal. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's totally common in British Columbia and indeed around North America. And there's more attention to that now because police shootings occur. People have died, and when they're just actually in distress, and somebody wanted to help them out and said, "Oh, I'll call 911 for them. I'll be a good Samaritan and do this," and then the person ends up dead. And in fact, this happened in Victoria some years ago, where I met this mother who had called to just get help for her son, and her own son ended up killed by police in Victoria. You can imagine the long-term effects for that woman, from that experience. So this happens in British Columbia and across North America. So yeah, what I don't think people should ever do that. Like it's unfortunate because right now kids are being trained in school to do exactly that. Workplace mental health first aid training tells colleagues to do that. Oh, if you see a colleague who's having emotional distress, kind of talk to them. But it's sort of like step one is kind of talk to them and suss out whether or not you think they're kind of dangerous, right? They're already embedding this little fear in you, and then and then direct them to professional help. Like that's one of the steps very early on, right? And call 911 if you're at all concerned, this kind of thing. So that's what kids and people are being trained to do. And I would train in the exact opposite direction. I'd say, don't, like if you can at all possibly avoid that, like if it really is a situation where you feel like serious threat here, physical threat or something, then of course, but even at that point, I've been in situations where I felt like, okay, this is escalating in such a way with this person that it's seeming physical. Often you can still find a way to de-escalate the situation, really connect with the person, say things like, what is it you really need? What would really help you? And is there anything I could do? Would you just like me to go away right now? Would you like me to stay? Right. And really touch base, and it can really shift the tone of that kind of situation. I think we got to be training people in doing that. Like how and also just do it instinctively, like with your friends, with your colleagues. Just don't be afraid, right, that this is some quote unquote medical problem that you're not equipped to deal with. No, in most vast majority of cases, it's somebody just having a distressful experience. Maybe some of it's erupting in ways that sound a little bit violent, like, oh, I want to punch somebody out or whatever. But you can often usually just talk through that, or I say, like, it doesn't have to be even talking. It could be, hey, let's go outside, or hey, let's go do something together, something that physically moves that person and gets their energy moving in different ways. So there's a myriad of ways to do this, but that's where the term mutual aid that I mentioned earlier comes up for me. Is we need to be helping each other more, not less right now, and less likely to direct people to professionals. When someone says, I'm feeling suicidal, don't tell them right away to call 988 or to call 911 or something. Rather, like if you're going to do that, then show you truly care by being there with them and finding some time for them, finding some energy for them.
Wow. I think, one of the things that I hear coming up again and again is this idea of human connection. And it almost seems to be almost like a lost art form in the system. And, Emmy and I had a really interesting conversation with some advocates who were helping the unhoused people on the south coast of British Columbia. And a lot of their focus was going into generating sort of human connection, and that being kind of the lead in terms of their work. And I just wonder, Rob, if you have any other sort of maybe guiding principles for people and practitioners that are in the system, in the mental health system, working right now to try and make things better.
People working in the system specifically?
Yeah. Why don't we start there?
Um, Yeah, I do think it's hard, right? Because we hear all the time that they're experiencing this blowback. They don't have appropriate authority. So I think they do need to organize more and figure out ways that they can kind of speak up in the workplace and kind of see if they can exert changes in different ways. I think they could also be speaking out more publicly. I'd like to see that as well, where like these nurses who spoke with Emmy, would actually come out in public and say, yeah, I'm doing this more often. I did find a nurse who did that for my book and said I was in circumstances where I did not want to be forcibly treating someone. I did not believe they needed to be forcibly treated, but other people on the team did, and I just went along. Things like this are important for the broader public to hear. So I think, and then by speaking to the broader public, hopefully that influences politicians and legislators and can work its way back into the system. But I'm not really an expert. Like I've always been sort of a bit of an outsider in terms of systems, right? Almost a bit like kamikaze, I guess you have to be this kind of journalist because you're often burning bridges along the way. People never want to talk to you again when you've kind of managed to get them to say things that they didn't really want to say publicly, and admit to publicly and things like that, or they'd try to avoid you. So, that's kind of the space that I tend to work in. And so I'm not an expert in how do you move things within these oppressive systems that work that way. I can only say, boy, I wish you'd call me so that, on the record or off the record, anonymously or not, I can get these stories. I enormously value those psychiatrists and those nurses and those other practitioners within the system who were at least willing to talk with me. And even if they disagreed with me, they would highlight where and why, and we could talk about that. And I think they add an enormous voice to the book. And so I think, okay, if that's my experience, and I think for readers it does as well, it makes my book more solid and credible to go, okay, there are these different points of view on this, and here's where Rob differs from them, and that's the argument he's making, but I can see the logic of this other argument. So I think overall it enhances public dialogue and it increases our collective intelligence. And so, yeah, I wish more of that was happening, not just for me then, right? That they were able to reach out to, say, the local peer group that might be trying to do activism in the space and say, hey, I'm a nurse and I actually see a lot of common ground with you. Is there some way we could collaborate together on something, to be an ally in those spaces and just be clear about what you can and can't say and where you can and can't go based on the limitations in your particular job. So yeah, I think if more of that was going on, that would be great.
I know there's also a class action lawsuit that folks are bringing forward to try to change the legislation in BC, which I really think needs to happen. I really think there needs to be a change in the legislation. I'm just really curious about, like, yeah, how, like, so what you just said struck a chord with me, Rob, in terms of the power of dialogue. And it seems like the mature approach, when we can see each other's positions and talk about that, it juxtaposes so much with the way that our system works, which seems immature to me, like a 5-year-old, like, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to lock you up. So how can we take steps to change the legislation in BC?
Well, the class action lawsuit is very important, and it's so frustrating that the government has been running interference on it for now. I think it's 6 years on technicalities, trying to prevent it from even getting into court, because I think they know full well that once it's in court, the BC Mental Health Act will get thrown out, as it did in Alberta recently. And unfortunately, though, then the Alberta government went back and quite cynically actually expanded some of the criteria. So they addressed one of the little pieces of it that the judge had highlighted, namely that brain injuries were not a mental illness and people should not be forcibly treated just because they have a brain injury. So they took that out of legislation, but then they broadened it drastically in terms of the kinds of criteria, just saying, well, anyone who's suffering negative effects as a result of their mental disorder is subject to the act. So that's not going to stand a Supreme Court challenge, but it could take another 10 or 20 years for someone to have the resources and time and effort to do that. So it's really frustrating that that's what's happening in British Columbia, all this resistance. That would be a really great thing to do. Or the government could just sit down tomorrow and say, let's talk about this. Let's figure out what is more in alignment with what the Supreme Court of Canada would probably defend and accept. So they could just negotiate tomorrow. Unfortunately, as we see, we're going in the opposite direction, where the current government, like the previous government, is still trying to expand who's going to be forcibly treated. And now it's anyone who's using substances in different ways is going to be subject to the act. That's the latest move. So yeah, how do we change that act, right? In this context where I think we have to go, it really needs more public attention. And one of the things I'm trying to do with the book is apprise people of like what a wide array of societies being affected by these laws. Includes lots of people like yourself, like my father, like Kyle's father, right? Like, so it's not only homeless people who have maybe had years of chronic challenges and problems in their lives going back to maybe they were abused as children and maybe they have addiction issues and stuff. So maybe there's a whole conflation of poverty and things that are going on where, yeah, there is a segment of that group that is really struggling and could really benefit from some kinds of help, right? Clearly. But they're not the only people that we should be talking about when we talk about these kinds of laws and these kinds of practices, right? We need to say, look, it's not only them. And so these laws apply to all these others as well. So what's not only good for them, but good for everybody? What does that look like? Because then I think too, when we realize it's happening to our own parents, maybe for some of those people who don't have true sympathy and understanding for homeless people, will gain it when they realize, oh, okay, like now I can see how many people are getting subjected to this kind of thing and why it is criticized even by those who represent populations of homeless people. So I think like public activity and education again needs to be a part of this. But yeah, practically, I mean, what's another way to do it? Could protest work? What kind of protest exactly? Unfortunately, you get pathologized. Oh, that's crazy people protesting this, right? Demonstrations. I definitely think more political organizing needs to occur. So right now, unfortunately, understandably, too many people who've experienced forced treatment are afraid to speak out because they don't want to be targeted. It's very understandable, but we need them. We need those voices and we need allies. We need the practitioners. We need people from academia. We need lawyers. Some of them are speaking out, but a lot of them aren't. And so they need to come together and organize together and speak out with unified voices. So they issue a press release around some of these issues right now. Unfortunately, this space has been decimated politically, and there's very few organizations that actually work in it. And of course, they aren't getting funding or support from the government. So that's a problem too. So we got to figure out how to fund political organization in this space.
Yeah, and it strikes me too that earlier you talked about how international bodies, in my mind, international human rights, those are being, and in Kyle's article and in your book, we're all seeing the evidence that the system isn't serving people. So there's no denying this, the facts, right? And, earlier you mentioned you're open to the system being dissolved. And I really don't personally, as someone who, has been well for over 10 years and, really healing myself and not needing to finding all of my solutions outside of the system, actually. I don't think for me that I have any faith in the system anymore. So yeah, I just wanted to share that and open it up to Kyle if he has any questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just add to that. It's very daunting. I mean, we look and there is some good news, I suppose. There's flashes of it here and there that we see, but it is very daunting what we're experiencing right now, what the trajectory looks like. And I suppose I just wonder, Rob, what gives you the inspiration to keep going, to keep doing the work that you're doing moving forward?
A number of things, but one of the big ones for sure is that I think people who've been through these experiences really value it getting some public light. And so I get lots of positive feedback for this work from people like, thank you for telling that story. Something similar happened to me, and it's so great to see somebody kind of putting it together with some facts and statistics and making it digestible for those who would take the time to go look and read something like that. So I get a lot of positive feedback that way. So in that sense, I guess I'm kind of doing it in part for those people. The other thing is just it's the level of pain and suffering I'm seeing being created. And I just instinctively want to figure out, like I think you two do, right? Around how can we turn the tide on this? Like, because here people are clearly being harmed. And in this case, it's ostensibly a helping system. It's supposed to be reducing people's harm. And it seems for a very large segment of people, it's doing the opposite. So surely if we talk about this some more and shed more light on it, we could turn this around. Right. So I think I'm going on that belief right now. I think the discouraging thing for me is what we were talking about a little while ago, that broader society is becoming more oppressive overall. And I'm concerned about that and the mental health system than involuntary treatment just being one part of that tendency in our society. So I think as a society, we need to grapple with our tendency to other people and to other people in this as a verb, like that we're saying that somehow, me oppressing someone else is a good thing. There's more and more people seem to think that, we're losing our fundamental notion of what democracies are supposed to be about and how they're supposed to work. And instead, people are thinking more fascistically, like, oh, I just think I know what's right and I'm going to impose that on others and that'll make the world a better place. And I don't think it does. And we're already seeing the evidence that it's backfiring in all kinds of ways and creating increased polarization. So yeah, I think that discourages me a lot. And so I am just going on that I want to bring that into the dialogue as well. I guess for that reason, to say we have to understand that there's a variety of things as a society we need to be grappling with. And I guess I am always heartened by human connection. When we can share our suffering, our pain, our concerns, we can really hear each other out. One of the most beautiful things I heard about a while ago was, they did a talking circle where just all these people, practitioners from the mental health care system, as well as former patients and family members, all just sat together and they just each listened to each other, share their perspective. And that was for all of them tremendously moving, right? Just to do that. And I believe it probably was transformative for all of them, right? Because of course, like, in this conversation, like I'm attacking a bit the practitioners that implement this powerful tool, but I know that they have perspectives and I want to hear those perspectives as well. I just want them to be open to hearing this pain and hearing that suffering, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize to them is this is something that's being silenced. So please open up and listen to it. But I absolutely always take calls from anybody, even when they're, radically pro-force, because I am trying to always understand that better. And I'm hoping that they're going to listen to me so that maybe we find somewhere in there. And often I do find that. Like a lot of people are pro-force, they're only pro-force because the system isn't helping their child or their loved one, right? And I kind of say, there's our common ground. This system is not working very well. So what can we do? What really are the improvements that you would like? And often it's things like, well, I wish I could have gotten financial support to help my loved one at home, so that I could have done it. I didn't really want to send them there, but I was getting so stressed out with their stress that I couldn't, so it can be things like that. It can lead to practical solutions that we're not getting to right now because people aren't actually sharing their points of view. They're polarizing and kind of just accusing each other.
I really love that idea about talking circles. And I hope that one day, we can lead a talking circle and do community events because I really feel like there is so much healing in storytelling. And that's exactly what you've devoted your 20-year plus career to. So I just want to encourage everyone out there to go buy Rob's book and read Your Consent is Not Required. And just thank you for sharing these stories that are often not heard. For many years I felt like it wasn't safe for me to speak out, because I didn't want to be locked up again. And now that I've safely been out of the system for 7+ years, 8+ years, I feel like I'm starting to slowly take these cautious steps forward, and people like you inspire me to keep doing that. So I just want to say thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yes, and likewise. I mean, I couldn't do have done that book without people like yourself who were willing and able to share their experiences and perspectives. And it's absolutely crucial part of it. I think that sharing my dad's story, but also sharing so many people's stories, it brings life to these issues in a way that's absolutely vital for people. So yeah, thank you. And thank Kyle. I know you've been really active out there too.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's been an honor to speak with you. Your insight and expertise, and also your ability to delve in and share some of those stories that we don't hear about, or new perspectives. And as you say, providing perspectives right around the table is truly inspiring. So thank you.
Right on. And for anyone out there who is interested in the books, called Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. And you can get 30% off the hardcover by using the code RIGHTS at the Ben Bella Books website. And you can find links to that from my own site, robwipond.com, or go to Ben Bella. And yeah, and it's available anywhere books are sold. There's an audiobook as oh, thank you. There's an audiobook version as well that I thought was really great. I thought the narrator did a really nice job through Audible Books. And there's an EPUB version that's cheaper if you want something still cheaper, available as well, and a Kindle version. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
And
We'll put all the links in the show notes too, so folks can follow up on Rob's work and buy the book and continue the conversation. That's where the healing is.
all right, great. And good luck in the future with your podcast. I'm looking forward to hearing more too.